No gum. No gum. Good morning, everybody. Again, it's a privilege and an honor to be up here this morning and share another lesson with you. If you guys don't already know by looking at the pictures posted, but today's lesson we're talking about God gives life to a boy. Our lesson will be from 2 Kings chapter 4, and we'll be looking at verses 8 through 37. A story like this kind of hits home for me. It always makes me, anytime I see something involving a child like this, it kind of makes me think and kind of put myself in that position. And I just kind of want to give a backstory on how I became a father. So I knew at a young age, maybe 18 to, what'd I say? What's so funny? How I became a father? Okay, come on guys. Get your mind out the gutter. Anyways, so, wow. Leave it to Joe and Brett, right? Alright, so, anyways, so at a pretty young age, I would babysit all my cousins, my younger cousins, and I kind of knew at a young age that at some point in my life I'd get married and I would want to have a family. And I was thinking about this morning, and one thing I thought of was, for those of you who don't know, I drive a truck for a living. That's my job. And I thought about it, and I'm like, me having that desire to be a father one day is actually why I'm a truck driver today. I know it sounds funny, but the job I was working at, I worked in the warehouse. And at the time, I was working a second shift. My hours were anywhere from 10:30, 11 o'clock start time, and I may not get off till 9, 10 o'clock at night. And I saw all the people above me in seniority that would get that day shift position ahead of me, and I'm thinking it's going to be 10, 15, maybe even longer before I can get to that day shift position. And I knew that I didn't want to work those kind of hours and have a family. So I was probably 19, 20 around that time, and when I first started that job, I would have to pull the trucks around the building, kind of back them out. And I thought to myself, I would never get in one of those things, never. But the opportunity presents itself. The truck driving job, they start at 5:30 in the morning, and they get off anywhere from 2 to 4, 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And it kind of, I saw it as that's my opportunity. Not now, but I know one day I'm going to get married. I'm going to want to have kids. And I want to have a earlier schedule so that I could have the evenings with my family. And the job presented itself, and that's how I became a truck driver. And 12 years later, I'm still doing it. But I knew at that time that I wanted to be a father. And then when I had that first child, it's crazy to think about, because I tell people this all the time, but I knew, okay, when this moment comes, it's going to be one of the best moments of my life. But no matter how much people tell me that, I'll be like, yeah, I know, it's going to be great, it's going to be great. But when that moment actually happens, it's like, wow, okay, this is even greater than I thought. And so preparing this lesson and seeing the story of this child dying, I kind of think about how hard that must be. One thing is, when someone dies at an old age, of course, it's sad, the family, the friends that they leave behind, mourn that loss. But to some extent, we all know we're going to die someday. So when you get up older in age, it's not as much of a surprise as to see a child die. And one thing that we can take from this is that life and death are in God's hands. It's not according to us. Jesus proved he can raise the dead no matter how long they've been dead when he raised Lazarus after 4 days. John 11. (38 through 44). Then Jesus, again groaning in himself, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone lay against it. Jesus said, "Take away the stone." Martha, the sister of him who was dead, said to him, "Lord, by this time there is a stench, for he has been dead for 4 days." Jesus said to her, "Did I not say to you, if you would believe, you would see the glory of God?" Then they took away the stone from the place where the dead man was laying, and Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me, and now that you always hear me because of the people who are standing by. I said this, that they may believe that you sent me." Now when he said these things, he cried with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come forth." And he who had died came out, bound hand and foot with grave cloths, and his face was wrapped with a cloth. Jesus said to them, "Loose him and let him go." So we see here in the earlier part of the verse, verse 39, Martha responds with, "There's a great stench. He's been dead for 4 days." But we see that God had that power to raise him from the dead, no matter how many days it had been. So we'll go into our lesson text in 2 Kings, starting in verse 8. A little background. Elisha lived in Abel-Meholah and often went to Mount Carmel to pray and meditate. And Shunem, which we'll talk about, is about the halfway point. We'll start in verse 8. Now it happened one day that Elijah went to Shunem, where there was a notable woman, and she persuaded him to eat some food. So it was, as often as he passed by, he would turn in there and eat some food. So we see here that it points out she was a notable woman. So she was apparently wealthy, and, but we see here that she was using what she was blessed with to bless others. Verse 9, and she said to her husband, "Look now, I know that this is a holy man of God who passes by us regularly." So by this we can see that she believed in God. She was a believer in God, considering she noticed Elijah and his servant passing by regularly, enough that she asked her husband to, verse 10, "Please let us make a small upper room on the wall, and let us put a bed for him there, and a table and chair, and a lampstand, so it will be whenever he comes to us, he can turn in there." So she sees him passing by regularly, and she encourages him to eat. You know, she gave him food and shelter, and at this point we see that she goes to her husband and says, "Let's give him a more permanent a place that he can stay, a room for himself, so that when he passes by, he has somewhere he can go." And we see that it provided a bed for him, a table and chair, and a lampstand. And it happened one day that he came there, and he turned in the upper room and lay down there. So we see that she was a believer of God. She shared what she was blessed with Elisha. She knew he was a man of God, and anytime he passed by, she would give him food and water. They built the room for him. And so, verse 11 through 13, we see that Elisha wanted to do something for her because of this. He wanted to kind of repay her for what she's doing for him. And it happened one day that he came there, and he turned in the upper room and lay down there. Then he said to Gehazi, his servant, "Call this Shunammite woman." When he had called her, she stood before him. And he said to him, "Say now to her, look, you have been concerned for us with all this care. What can I do for you? Do you want me to speak on your behalf to the king or to the commander of the army?" She answered, "I dwell among my own people." So he sends his servant to call her in so that he could see what he can do for her to repay this, everything that she's sharing with him. He wanted to return the favor. And he tells Gehazi to ask her, what can we do for you with all this hospitality you're giving us? And we see her response is, "I dwell among my own people." So she was reluctant. She didn't really want to ask for anything. verse 14 through 16. Verse 14, so he said, what then is to be done for her? And Gehazi answered, actually, she has no son, and her husband is old. So by that verse, we see that Gehazi, through talking to her, he's learned that she has no child, and she's of an old age, right? And so he said, call her. When he had called her, she stood in the doorway. Then he said, about this time next year you shall embrace a son. And she said, no, my lord, man of God, do not lie to your maidservant. One of the things that this lesson book kind of implied was that she had probably tried to have a child and just couldn't. Her and her husband, they were of old age. One thing is that it is implied that her husband, being older, and he was beyond childbearing age. It appears they tried without success to have a child, and seems to have reached a point of accepting it. So it's almost like she was accepting that she wasn't going to have any children. And that's why when he tells her this, she responds with, man of God, do not lie to your maidservant. So she doesn't believe it. And think about that. Like, someone who has tried to have a child and can't, the idea of what greater blessing could God give them than to bestow, a child on them, someone who's not able to have one. Any comments, questions? No? Okay. And we see in verse 17 that it came true. But the woman conceived and bore a son when the appointed time had come, of which Elisha had told her. So we see she has that child. Okay, she didn't believe it was going to happen at first, but we see that it happened. She has that child. Verse 17 through 19. Oh, I'm sorry, 18. And the child grew. Now it happened one day that he went out to his father to the reapers, and he said to his father, my head, my head. So he said to the servant, carry him to his mother. A couple things we can take from this. We can see that he's grown. We see that he's grown. He's grown enough to a point where he can go out to his father in the field, right? He can go out on his own. But he's also small enough to where they can carry him back to his mother. Right? Any questions? No? All right. So, don't know his exact age. I like to think of it as, one of the younger children. He big enough to where he can go out his own. The mom's not worried about, let me make sure you get where you're going. And in verse 20, when he had taken him and brought him to his mother, he sat on her knees till noon, and then he died. So we see he was small enough to sit in her lap. And what really hit me was the end of that verse when it says he died. So we can see that he died in her lap. And one thing I think of is how hard it must be to lose a child as it is, but to sit there and have your child die in your arms and not be able to do anything. One thing that made me think of is like when my kids get sick. I mean, most parents, and I'm sure most of us here, when our child's sick, we want to take that from them. We want to put ourselves in their position so that they don't go through that, right? We would take the pain and the suffering for them. And I'm sure this woman, if she had the opportunity, would trade spots with her son. One thing, me and JC have talked about this a lot as far as when you lose a child, because like I said, when I study something like this, sometimes it's hard for me to kind of wrap my head around. But as a Christian, we need to look at it as, because you see people in the world, when they lose a child, they blame God. They get angry towards God. Why have you taken my child from me? Why did you even give them to me just to take them from me? But one thing, I'm sure you guys have heard the saying, it's better to have loved and lost than to not have loved at all. And that's one thing that, like, me and JC talked about was from that standpoint, as hard as it is, and I can't imagine how hard it is, we need to be thankful for the fact that he even gave us that opportunity to have that child and to love that child. One thing we can take, another thing me and JC pointed out to me that I took was we could take some good from that, because we know that children are not at the age of accountability, so they're in a safe position, right? So when that does happen, we could take comfort knowing that they're gonna have a home in heaven. Look at 2 Samuel 12. 22 through 23. We're going to look at David, and because we know David lost a son and how he responded to it. Jerry actually had a very good lesson on this just a few weeks ago. And when he did it, towards the end of these verses, it really kind of, you can take a lot from it and get that comfort that I was just telling you guys about. We know that he fasted for, when his child was sick, he was fasting, right? And when the child did die, he stopped fasting. And people asked him, like, why you fasted all this time? Why are you going to eat now? And his response in verse 22, and he said, while the child was alive, I fasted and wept, for I said, who can tell whether the Lord will be gracious to me that the child may live? But now he is dead, why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I shall go to him, but he shall not return to me. And hearing that verse, because I had heard through those discussions with JC, he made a great point in that we can't bring that child back. We need to take the necessary steps, obey God, so that we could go to where they're going, right? And hearing him say that's one thing, but actually seeing it in the Scripture is just so much better, because you see right here at the end of verse 23, can I go back, bring him back again? I shall go to him. So he's accepted that he can't bring his child back. So he's going to do what he needs to go where he is. Any comments, questions? Okay. So she decides, go back to 2 Kings, and we see that she decides to go to Elisha, I'm sorry. Then she called to her husband and said, please send me one of the young men and one of the donkeys, that I may run to the man of God and come back. So he said, why are you going to him today? It is neither the new moon nor the Sabbath. And she said, it is well. So here we see that she's calling for her husband to bring the donkey and the young men so that she can go to Elisha. And his response is, why today? It's neither the new moon or the Sabbath. So obviously they went there, they went to visit him, but he was just going out of the blue like that. He was questioning, like, why are you going today? And her response is, it is well. So what do we see here by her telling her husband, it is well? Joe? Right.
Because she knew that her faith demonstrates that it would be reconciled.
Right.
She wasn't caught up on the details. You can consider that a detail.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one of the things that I, one of the suggestions that the book points out that I have says that, we don't know exactly why she responded that way, but back then the Jews buried their dead the same day that they died. And so it could have been that she feared that if she had told him, he would immediately go and want to bury the son, right? And she didn't want to give up on him yet. Does that make sense? And it shows that she obviously believed that there's something that Elisha could do. Verse 24. Then she saddled a donkey and said to her servant, "Drive and go forward. Do not slacken the pace for me unless I tell you." And so she departed and went to the man of God at Mount Carmel. So it was when the man of God saw her afar off that he said to his servant Gehazi, "Look, the Shunammite woman." So from this we see that he can see her from afar off, that she's coming, and he can tell that something's wrong. And so he sends his servant out to meet her. He tells Gehazi to run to her, and she tells him the same thing that she told her husband. We see that in verse 26. "Please run now to meet her and say to her, 'It is well with you. Is it well with you? Is it well with your husband? Is it well with the child?' And she answered, 'It is well.'" So we see here again, he sends the servant out to ask her, something's wrong. You go meet her, ask her if she's well, if her husband's well, if her child's well. And she responds with the same exact response that she responded to her husband, "It is well." Once again, we don't know her exact reasoning for that. One of the suggestions was that she wanted to wait until she got to Elisha. Possibly. We don't know for sure. Verse 27, when she came to the man of God at the hill, she caught him by the feet. So that could have been why. She wanted to get to him and not let Gehazi know what was going on before she saw Elisha. And we see what Gehazi does, but Gehazi came near to push her away. So he tries to step in and push her away to get her away from Elisha. And the man of God said, "Let her alone, for her soul is in deep distress, and the Lord has hidden it from me and has not told me." So we see she's in deep distress. She clutches him by the feet. Gehazi responds by trying to push her away, and Elijah responds with, "No, let her alone. Her soul is in deep distress." She obviously bitter and blamed Elisha, reminding him that she had not asked for a son. We see that as we continue on. So she said, "Did I ask a son of my Lord? Did I not say, 'Do not deceive me'?" Now, like we talked about before, she's responding in the way that a lot of people in the world do today when they lose a child, is they blame God. They get bitter towards God. Why have you taken him from me? Why did you even give him to me in the first place? Instead of responding with, as hard as it is, just being thankful that you even had that time up to that point with that child. Then, verse 29, then he said to Gehazi, "Get yourself ready and take my staff in your hand and be on your way. If you meet anyone, do not greet him, and if anyone greets you, do not answer him, but lay my staff on the face of the child." So Elisha responds by sending Gehazi, "Take my staff, go ahead, go to the boy, lay my staff on his head." And in verse 30, and the mother of the child said, "As the Lord lives and as your soul lives, I will not leave you." So he arose and followed her. So he says, sends Gehazi ahead, and she says, I'm not leaving you. I'm staying with you." And so he gets up and he follows her. Any comments, questions? No? Okay. All right. And we see that Gehazi goes ahead. Now Gehazi went on ahead of them and laid the staff on the face of the child, but there was neither voice nor hearing. Therefore he went back to meet him and told him, saying, "The child has not awakened." So we can take from this that the woman, the Shunammite woman, and Elijah are going, right? but we see that Gehazi is ahead of them. He had gone out ahead of them to do what Elijah had told him to do, to lay the staff on his hand. And we see that it didn't bring the boy back. And so he comes back and he meets them, wherever they are on the road, and tells them, hey, he's still dead. When Elijah came into the house, there was the child lying dead on his bed. So now Elijah has arrived. He goes in and he sees the child lying. One thing I forgot to point out, the mother had taken him up to Elijah's room. So that room that they had built for Elijah, that's where the boy was. He was in that room, and so Elijah goes in there and sees the boy lying dead on the bed. He went in, therefore, shut the door behind the two of them, and prayed to the Lord. So here we see that him and the boy are the only two in the room right now. Okay? He shut the door behind the two of them. So that tells us that the Shunammite woman and Gehazi weren't in the room at this point. It was just Elisha and the boy. And he went up and lay on the child and put his mouth on his mouth, his eyes on his eyes, and his hands on his hands. And he stretched himself out on the child, and the flesh of the child became warm. So we see the purpose. What can we take from the purpose of him laying on the child? Body heat. This reminds me of, there was an instance when we went to the homeschool camp. Me and Emmy went last year. And one night, I forgot to close the little window things, and it got real cold that night. And I was kind of snuggling up with her to kind of keep her warm. And I couldn't. I woke up in the middle of the night and I had to go to the bathroom. I was like, I'll be all right. I'll be all right. And so, a little back up. The reason we were so cold is because I forgot to bring my sleeping bag, so I was sharing with her. So I wasn't prepared, but I'm snuggling her, trying to keep her warm, and she slept throughout the whole night until I had to go to the bathroom, obviously. But she slept through the whole night, and I was able to keep her warm using my body heat, the covers, to keep her warm. And it got to a point where I was like, I don't know if I'm gonna make it till morning. I'm gonna try. I'm good. And it finally got to a point where I was like, I'm just gonna. Luckily, our cabin was right next to the bathhouse, and I was like, I'm just gonna go real quick. I'll be right back. And just from the time of me leaving to go to the bathroom and come back, she was awake and she was freezing. And I'm like, yeah, we're cold. Let's go. And it hit me that they had had a fire up at the fellowship area that evening before. I'm like, we'll go up it. Hopefully the fire's still going. If not, we'll get it going again. And we walked down the path and we got about halfway there, and I'm like, my car's right there. We're going to the car. And we went to the car and turned the heat on. But that just shows she was fine all night leading up to that point. She didn't wake up at all. As much as I couldn't sleep because I had to go to the bathroom so bad, she didn't wake up at all until I got up and I left to go to the bathroom. Now I'm not there to help keep her warm. And by the time I got back, Dad, I'm cold, So we see that was his purpose for laying on the child, was to warm the child. He returned, and he went and lay on the child and put his mouth on his mouth, his eyes on his eyes, and his hands on his hands. And he stretched himself out on the child, and the flesh of the child became warm. He returned and walked back and forth in the house. So from that we see that the child's not still dead. He's not alive. His body's warmed a little bit, but he's still dead. And when you see that he returned and walked back and forth in the house, one thing that we can kind of take from this is when he first went in there, he was praying to God as he was doing these things, right? And you think about him walking and pacing back and forth, he was probably praying at that time as well. You have a comment?
Yes. One of the things that I think from this is, the woman, she ran, just like any of us would have done. You don't talk to your neighbors, you don't talk to anyone, you you run to that person who's going to help you.
Right.
And, the servant tried to stop because probably didn't know what was going on, a little concerned by the whole thing. And then Elijah, he states that it was hidden from him by God. So the woman had to demonstrate great faith, I think.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Is that God is, and even when Elijah gave her his staff, Elijah was very certain that once he gave her the instructions, and in my mind, these stories play out like a movie, so sorry. But in my mind, she's running with this special gift. She's running, with this special gift to put on her child, to help him come back to life, and that didn't happen. So
right.
Put him up to the room. And again, Elisha.
Sorry.
But so then Elisha goes up to the room, and he is still, it's hidden from him. So he's doing what he knows is to pray.
To pray to God, right.
To me, it was a great test of faith.
Right, because we see here, he didn't just go in there and do it for himself. He wasn't, I'm going to do this. I'm going to bring this boy back to life. No, he prayed to God. He knew that in order to do it, he would need God. And that's one thing I thought of when in verse 35 when it says he returned and walked back and forth in the house was, think about when he's probably pacing back and forth, and I'm sure he's probably praying more at the time. And again, so we see a second time, again he went up and stretched himself out on him, and then the child sneezed 7 times, and the child opened his eyes. So we see here he's pacing, probably more than likely praying as he's pacing, and he goes back and he lays back on him, and the child sneezes 7 times. We don't know what the sneezes accomplished, but it's been suggested that they may have forced some toxic elements out of his lungs that were preventing him from breathing. We don't know that for sure, but it's one thing that you could think of. Whatever the benefit, it is clear that the boy was dead and now he's alive, right? 'Cause if he was still dead, he wouldn't have sneezed 7 times, obviously. So, verse 36, and he called Gehazi and said, "Call this Shunammite woman." So he called her, and when she came in to him, he said, "Pick up your son." So the boy sneezed 7 times, he's alive now, and in Elijah's response, he calls for Gehazi, and he tells Gehazi, "Bring in the Shunammite woman." Because remember, they're not in the room. It's just Elisha and the boy at this time. He shut the door with just them in there. And so he calls for them, and he tells the Shunammite woman to pick him up. And in verse 37, we see, so she went in, fell at his feet, and bowed to the ground. Then she picked up her son and went out. Okay, so what's one thing that we notice here in verse 37? Anybody? Think about this woman. She didn't think she was going to have a child, right? She has a child, has it taken away from her, and then she comes to the door and she sees that her child's alive again. What would most mothers do in that instance? Grab the child. Most people would push right past Elisha and go straight to that child and rejoice in the fact that their child is now back, right? They have, their boy has life again. But what did she do? She showed gratitude. She bowed at his feet before she went to her son. And I was talking to Joe about this before. As I was studying, because these booklets they give us, I get a lot from them. I like to take some of what the points that they make, but then others, I just kind of leave out. I kind of put my own stuff in there. And going back to some of what we talked to yesterday, as far as taking what you hear and testing it with the scripture, this is a good example because in the book, if you read in this booklet, the last sentence of this says, before leaving, she fell before him and bowed. So when I read that, I'm thinking, okay, someone could read this and they could see that, they could take that she went in, she saw her son, and then before she left, she bowed at his feet. But when we test that with the scripture, we see more detail that she actually bowed at his feet before she grabbed her son. And so that I was thinking about that, and I just thought, that's a good example of not just taking something we read in a booklet or something that we hear, but actually testing it with the scriptures. That was, like I said, because I had read the verse, and then I saw that, and I was like, people could kind of take that differently, that she just, bowed at his feet before she left. Any comments, questions? Joe?
Throughout this whole account, you see the emotional control and stability that she expresses over and over. And to me, that's impressive and a good example, because I know I don't always do that. But from the very get-go, she sits with him while he's sick to the point of death for several hours apparently, and then just easily goes and lays it down, and she tells people on the way as well.
Mm-hmm.
And just calmly goes and gets what she does. I mean, she doesn't delay, certainly, but she's not running around crazy.
Not panicking.
Not panicking and acting silly, making bad choices and amplifying stuff. And here at the end, you see the same thing, just like what you just said. I think most people's first reaction would be react, just go and do something. And Jerry's spoken on this a number of times, but we have a responsibility to patiently respond rather than just fly off the handle and react to everything.
Yeah, I have that's one thing that kind of makes me think of, that's one thing that I struggle with at work a lot. When negative things happen to me at work, I tend to respond to it immediately instead of, which I've been getting better at, but just kind of not, showing that initial response and just handling it in a better situation. And that goes back to, like you said, she was patient throughout the whole thing. And think about it, if you see your child that sick, what's another thing she could have done before he even died? You didn't see her, like Joe said, panicking to the point where she leaves the child there and goes and gets Elijah before he even died. Like something's really wrong, like he's not doing good, he's about to die. She didn't show that. She stayed there, and did what she could to comfort him. And like I said, it goes back to, as a parent, when you see your child in that situation, you want to take that from them. Any other comments, questions?
Dan?
Yeah.
I know we're not supposed to do a lot of speculation, but I wondered when she first came to Elisha and told him that the child was dead, he was not aware. He said that, well, the Lord has hid it from him. He didn't know that he was dead, actually. So he sent his servant and the staff ahead. He put a lot of power in that staff. He did a lot of things with it, of course. And I've wondered if he didn't think that the staff had that power to heal him. It wasn't until he got there and found out that that didn't work. Then he prayed to God.
Right.
That's when he really got the power, when he talked it over with God.
Right.
He tried it himself. And
Exactly. Exactly. And that goes back to like what we said. When he went in the room, he didn't just try to do it himself. But like you said with the sending the staff, I didn't even, that's a good point. I didn't even think about that. Like by sending him with the staff, he was essentially trying to do it himself without consulting with God. And that's one thing we learned yesterday. I mean, we learn every day, but we talked about yesterday and we talked about today that when we don't seek God's counsel or we don't look to God for things, that's when things usually go wrong. But we see most people today that when they wait until the things go wrong and then they blame God, right? And not realizing that, hey, maybe it's because you weren't looking to God. Any other comments, questions? No? Sorry I ended a little early, but I'm going to ask Joe if you'd lead us in prayer before we dismiss.
Let's pray together. Heavenly Father, how grateful we are that we have an opportunity to come together and to study your word. We're so grateful for our brother Dan, for his willingness and ability to prepare a lesson to study and to bring us a message from your word. Father, we're grateful that we have the Bible, that we can look into the see what your will for us is. We can find these great examples of how we are to act and how we are to behave, and we can do our best to emulate those and to be better servants of yours. Father, we pray for this congregation as we continue throughout our morning services this morning. Father, we pray that all things that we do during our worship hour are done in spirit and truth and decently and in order. We pray, Father, that all things are done to your glorification and not our own. We ask that as we continue forward, you help us to be active participants in the worship service, not just sitting here checking off the box that we showed up, but trying diligently to serve you in a way that you deserve and wish to be served. These things we pray in Christ's name. Amen.
Oh, yeah. I didn't hit a button on it, so I might have hit a button on it.
Can't do anything.